The auctioneer's voice carried sharp and clear across the Nebraska dust in the summer of 1874, cutting through the midday heat like a blade. And Inez Collins stood beside a broken wagon with her chin raised so high it hurt, because she would not let a single soul in that crowd see her cry. The wagon had given out 3 miles east of Millhaven, one of the rear wheels cracking clean through on a rut that should have been filled 2 seasons prior by the county road crew. A crew that never came because Millhaven was the kind of town that the territorial government forgot whenever funds were being distributed and remembered only when taxes were due. The wagon had been her father's, built by his own hands back in Missouri, and now it sat slanted in the dirt of the main street like a tired old dog that had finally laid down for good. 2 of the mules were still hitched to it, standing in the sun with their long ears pinned back, equally unhappy about the whole arrangement. Her father, Robert Collins, had died 6 weeks prior, taken by a fever that moved faster than any doctor could chase, and Inez had been left with his debts, his land claim, and his broken-down wagon. She was 23 years old, with dark hair that the heat of the day had pulled loose from its pins, and brown eyes that the people of Millhaven would later describe in their letters home as either fierce or heartbroken, depending on who was doing the writing. The debts her father had left were not enormous, but they were more than a woman alone could cover without selling everything she owned, and the banker, a wiry man named Elbert Price who smiled too much, had called in the notes the moment Robert Collins had been put into the ground. Elbert Price had organized the public sale. He had also, apparently, decided that Inez herself was an asset to be auctioned along with the wagon and its contents, under the frontier custom of indentured labor contracts, a practice that was already fading in the eastern states but clung on stubbornly in the territories where the law was whatever the man with the most money said it was. It was not slavery, in the strict legal sense. But standing on a dry patch of Nebraska earth, while men with squinting eyes looked her over the way they might appraise a good horse, Inez could not have told you what the meaningful difference was. The crowd was not enormous. Millhaven was a town of perhaps 300 souls, give or take those who drifted in for the season and moved on when the work ran out. There were cattlemen in dusty hats, a few homestead farmers with their wives standing a respectful distance back and wearing expressions of uncomfortable sympathy, a pair of men from the railroad survey crew who had been in town for 2 weeks and seemed to treat everything as entertainment, and one man standing alone at the edge of the crowd, leaning against the rail of the dry goods store with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low. That man was Charles Hale. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red sandstone that rimmed the creek beds out west of town. He had come to Millhaven 4 months prior with enough money to purchase a modest ranch parcel on the south side of the Platte River tributary, and enough quiet about him that the townspeople had not yet made up their minds whether he was trustworthy or merely reserved. He had worked hard since arriving, had paid his bills promptly at Delacroix's general store, had helped old widow Hutchins repair her fence after the spring flooding without being asked, and had said almost nothing about where he had come from or what he had done before. The old-timers approved of him cautiously. The younger men who liked to drink at Harmon's saloon found him dull. The women in town noticed him in the way that women notice a man who carries himself well and keeps his manners intact even when the social situation does not demand it. He had not come to the auction to bid. He had come because he needed a new bolt of canvas for the linta he was building, and Delacroix's was closed on account of price, having pressured every business on the main street to pause their operations so that more people would congregate for the sale. Charles had been standing there for 20 minutes, mildly irritated, watching the proceedings with the flat attention of a man who has seen enough of the world to be rarely surprised by it. Then Inez Collins had been walked up to stand beside the broken wagon, and everything about the morning changed. It was not her beauty that stopped him first, though she was beautiful in the unself-conscious way of a woman who has been working hard her whole life and has not had a great deal of leisure to contemplate her own face in a mirror. It was the angle of her chin, the absolutely unbending refusal in her posture. The way her hands, hanging at her sides, were balled into fists so tight that her knuckles had gone white, and the way she was directing her gaze at some fixed point on the far horizon, as if she had mentally removed herself from Millhaven, Nebraska, entirely, and relocated to some interior country where Elbert Price and his auction and his smug little smile could not reach her. Elbert Price was speaking now, laying out the terms. A 1-year labor contract, transferable upon satisfaction of the debt. The successful bidder would receive the services of one able-bodied woman, experienced in domestic work, farm labor, and general frontier management, plus the contents of the wagon, which included tools, dry goods, and the frame of the wagon itself for salvage. He listed her father's debt. He listed the wagon's estimated value, minus the repair costs. He smiled his too-wide smile and invited opening bids. There was a horrible silence. Then a man named Garrett Webb, who raised cattle south of town and had a reputation for working his hired hands past the limits of reasonable human endurance, called out a number that was insultingly low, and a few other men laughed, and Inez Collins did not move a single muscle in her face. The bidding climbed slowly, grudgingly, as if each man knew he was participating in something that should not be happening, and was embarrassed enough to not want to commit to it too enthusiastically, but not embarrassed enough to walk away. Webb pushed the bid up steadily, counterbidding against a rancher named Stultz who owned land up near the ridge, and had a wife who had left him 2 years ago for very good reasons that everyone in town knew, but no one discussed openly. The number was getting high enough to cover the debt now, and Price was pleased with himself, and the 2 bidding men were looking at Inez with the particular calculating expression of men who were thinking about economics, and, underneath the economics, other things they would not have admitted to in daylight. Charles Hale straightened up from the rail of the dry goods store. He pushed off with his shoulder, crossed the dirt street at an unhurried walk that nonetheless covered the ground quickly, and stepped into the edge of the crowd just as Stultz was raising his hand for another bid. "I'll bid for the wagon and the woman both," Charles said. His voice was not loud, but it had the quality of a voice that people listened to, and the crowd shifted and parted slightly to look at him. "Whatever clears the debt entirely. Name the number, Price." Elbert Price blinked. "Mr. Hale, the custom of the auction is to bid incrementally on." "I'm aware of how auctions work," Charles said pleasantly. "I'm saying I'll pay the debt in full right now and take the wagon and its contents as the consideration. The woman's contract goes with the settlement. What is the total amount owed?" Price stated the number. It was substantial. A murmur went through the crowd. Garrett Webb made a sound that was not quite a protest and not quite acceptance, the sound of a man calculating whether he wanted to compete with someone who had just laid their whole hand on the table at once. "Agreed," Charles said. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, pulled out a leather billfold, and counted the bills onto the small table that Price had set up for the transaction, counting each one slowly and deliberately, which had the added effect of making the entire crowd stand very still and watch him do it. When the last bill was laid down, Elbert Price picked them up and counted them himself, because he was that kind of man. Then he nodded and said the transaction was complete and the debt was discharged, and the crowd began to disperse in the way that crowds do when the main event is over and there is nothing left to gawk at. And Inez Collins, who had not moved from her spot beside the broken wagon, turned and looked at Charles Hale for the first time. Her eyes were not grateful, they were furious. He had expected that in some part of himself, though he could not have articulated exactly why. He met her gaze steadily and said nothing, which was perhaps the wisest thing he could have done in that particular moment. "You bought me," she said. Her voice was very controlled, too controlled. The kind of control that is stretched tight over something that is shaking. "I paid your father's debt," he said, "which is a different thing. The paper says otherwise. The paper says you owe a year of labor to whoever paid the debt. I intend to let you work that off at whatever rate you choose to set, and if you decide you want to walk away from Millhaven entirely and never look back, I will consider the debt satisfied by the simple fact that you are free of price." She stared at him for a long moment. The mules shifted in their harness. Somewhere behind her, a child called out for its mother and a dog barked twice and went quiet. "And the wagon," she said. "Also yours. I'll pay to have the wheel repaired. I don't want your charity." "It's not charity," he said. "It's a transaction. You'll work for it. Working for you. Working wherever you see fit. My ranch if you want the work. Delacroix's store if he'll have you. Anywhere in this county. I'll not hold you to my property specifically." She looked at him with an expression that was trying very hard to remain angry and was being complicated by something she could not yet name. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you do that? You don't know me. You've never spoken a word to me before this moment." Charles was quiet for a moment. He looked at the broken wagon, at the two miserable mules, at the thin film of dust on everything, at the empty main street where the crowd had scattered. "Because what Price was doing wasn't right," he said simply, "and I happen to have the money. That's all." Inez Collins did not thank him. She turned and laid her hand on the side of the broken wagon, the way you might touch the shoulder of someone who was hurting, and she breathed in once slowly, and then she said, "Where is this ranch of yours?" "South side of the creek, about 4 miles out." She nodded once, the way a person nods when they are accepting a situation they did not choose and intend to manage it with complete competence regardless. Then she said she would need to speak to old Mrs. Brannock at the boarding house first, because she had left her trunk there 2 days ago when the wagon broke down, and she would need to collect it. And then she walked away from him down the main street, and Charles Hale stood by the broken wagon and the unhappy mules and watched her go, and felt something shift in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. The wheel on the wagon was repaired by a man named Tomas Escobar, who ran the smithy at the east end of town, and whose family had been in the territory since before it was a territory, and who did the work quickly and well without charging the outrageous rate he might have charged a stranger. He had known Robert Collins and had liked him, and he regarded Inez with the kind of respectful familiarity that comes from a long shared community. When Inez brought the wagon around to his shop, he patted the frame and said Robert Collins had built it solid, and it would last another 20 years now that the wheel was sorted. And Inez pressed her lips together and nodded, and paid him with money that Charles had left with her, and that particular transaction cost her more pride than she had expected. She drove the wagon out to the Hale ranch that afternoon with her trunk in the back, and the two mules still miserable, and her jaw set at the same angle it had been at during the auction. The road south was dry and rutted, and the afternoon sun was the flat, relentless kind that turns the whole sky a washed-out white and makes even the grass look tired. The land out here was broad and open in a way that could strike you as either magnificent or desolate depending on the state of your heart, and Inez's heart was in a complicated state that she had not had enough quiet to examine properly. The Hale Ranch was not impressive by any measure that measured impressiveness in terms of finished buildings and settled appearance. There was a main structure that was partway between a cabin and a proper house, built solid but clearly still in progress, with new lumber along one side where an addition had been started and not yet roofed. There was a barn that was in better shape than the house, which told you something about the man's priorities. There was a kitchen garden that had been planted with more ambition than expertise, with things growing that shouldn't have been planted together, and spacing that suggested a man who had read about gardening rather than done much of it. There were fences that were good and tight, and a water trough that was clean, and a pair of horses that were well kept, and came to the fence to look at the arriving wagon with interest. Charles came out of the barn when he heard the wagon, wiping his hands on a cloth, and he looked at Inez sitting up on the board seat with her back straight and her face unrevealing, and he said, "I've got a room in the house that's finished. It's yours if you want it." "I'll want it," she said, because sleeping in a barn or the wagon was something she had done before and could do again, but it was not something she was going to volunteer for when a room was being offered. She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for him to assist her, which he noticed and accepted without comment, and she walked to the back of the wagon and pulled out her trunk by one handle, and he moved to take the other handle, and for a moment they carried it between them toward the house without speaking, which was about as intimate a thing as two strangers can do in the first hours of an acquaintance. The room was small but dry and had a window that faced east, which meant morning light, which Inez had always preferred. There was a narrow bed with a corn husk mattress and a wool blanket, and a washstand with a basin and a pitcher, and a hook on the back of the door. It was adequate. It was more than adequate. She had slept in worse places during the last 6 weeks of managing her father's illness and death, and the neatness of it, the simple functionalism of it, made something in her throat tighten unexpectedly. She set her jaw and did not let it show. That evening, Charles made supper from a pot of salt pork and dried beans that he had clearly been living on for some time, and Inez ate it because she was hungry and said nothing about its quality, and afterward she asked him what work he needed done and he laid it out for her plainly. The garden needed serious attention. The addition to the house needed to be finished before winter, which was only 4 months away, and while he could handle the heavy framing, there was interior work, chinking and plastering and laying the floor, that could use another pair of hands. The horses needed regular care. The equipment needed an inventory, and anything broken needed to be listed so it could be repaired or replaced before the hard weather came. It was a full season of work. It was the kind of work Inez Collins had been doing her entire life. She nodded and said she would start with the garden in the morning because the state of it was an offense against everything her mother had taught her, and Charles looked at the garden through the window and had the decency to look slightly embarrassed, and she felt something that was almost amusement, which surprised her, and she covered it quickly and excused herself to her room. She lay awake that night listening to the creek, which was close enough to the house that you could hear it when the night was quiet, and she thought about her father and about the debt, and about Elbert Price, and about standing in that main street with the whole town watching and feeling the precise quality of powerlessness that comes from having other people make decisions about your life in public. She thought about Charles Hale counting those bills onto the table with such deliberate calm, as if paying a woman's debt at public auction were a perfectly ordinary thing to do on a Tuesday morning. She was not grateful. She was not going to be grateful. Gratitude would imply that what had been done to her had been acceptable, that the circumstances required someone to rescue her, and she refused to accept that framing. She was competent. She was capable. She would have found another way eventually. He had simply moved faster than another way had presented itself, and now she was bound by that, bound by his money and his quiet certainty, and the binding chafed her even though the man himself had given her no reason to resent him personally. That was the problem, actually. She could not find a personal reason to resent him, and so she resented the situation instead, and she was honest enough with herself, alone in the dark with the creek running outside her window, to acknowledge that the two things were not the same. In the morning she attacked the garden with the focused fury of a woman who has a great deal of energy that needs somewhere constructive to go, and by midday she had replanted 2/3 of it in proper rows with appropriate companion plantings, and pulled enough weeds to fill the wheelbarrow twice, and Charles had come by the garden fence twice, once to bring her water, and once to watch what she was doing, and both times she had been too busy to do more than acknowledge his presence briefly. At noon he brought out cold cornbread and dried beef and 2 cups of coffee, and set them on the fence post without comment, and they ate in the partial shade of the fence, and the silence between them was no longer the silence of two strangers, but the silence of two people who are beginning to take each other's presence for granted, which is a different thing entirely. "Where did you come from?" Inez asked, because she had decided that knowing who he was might make the situation more manageable. "Kansas originally," he said. "Before that, Ohio. Ohio is a long way to come." "Yes. What brought you this far west?" He was quiet for a moment. He had the quality of a man who thinks before he speaks, which Inez respected even when it frustrated her. "I was looking for something that had more space around it," he said finally. She considered that. "Running from something or running towards something." "Mostly just moving," he said. "There's a middle condition between the two that doesn't get enough acknowledgement." She looked at him. He was looking at the garden with the same mild, steady expression he seemed to apply to everything. "My father was like that," she said before she meant to say it. "After my mother died, he was always moving. Missouri to Iowa to here. He kept saying the next place would be the right place." "Was it?" "He died before he found out." She said it flatly, not looking for sympathy, just stating a fact. "I'm sorry," Charles said. Not the performative sorry that people reflexively produced, but a quiet, genuine one that did not require a response. She nodded and finished her coffee and went back to the garden. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that Inez had not expected, and that crept up on her without her permission. She woke early and worked hard, and the work was good. The clean, purposeful kind that leaves you tired in your body, but settled in your mind. The garden came back from her intervention remarkably well, and the first tentative green shoots that came up in the corrected rows gave her a satisfaction that was almost violent in its intensity. She found that the interior work on the addition was something she was good at, having watched her father and helped him build their Missouri house years ago, and she and Charles fell into a working partnership on it that was efficient and surprisingly companionable. He was not a man who talked constantly, which she appreciated because she was not a woman who talked constantly, and so the silences between them were productive ones, filled with the sounds of hammers and saws and the occasional exchange of information that the work required. But he was also not a man who was silent out of coldness or disinterest. When he spoke as if what he was saying mattered, and he listened when she spoke in the same way. She found herself saying things to him that she had not said to anyone since her father had been healthy, small observations about the land or the weather or the quality of a piece of lumber, and he received them all with the same uncomplicated attention. She did not forgive him for the auction. She had decided that, and she kept the decision in place like a stone wall that she was aware of and navigated around rather than through. It was not that she thought he had been wrong, exactly. It was more that accepting his kindness completely would require her to acknowledge how dire her situation had been, and she was not ready to do that yet, because acknowledging it completely meant sitting with the full weight of her father's death and her own aloneness and the absolute arbitrariness of the world that had put her on a Nebraska street to be bid on like furniture, and she was not ready to sit with all of that at once. But she watched him. She watched him the way she watched weather, the way you learn to read the sky not because you can change what it does, but because knowing what it is doing helps you make better decisions. She watched him with old Mrs. Hutchins, whose fence he had fixed, whom he visited once a week and brought things from the store, not because anyone asked him to, but because she was alone and the walk was long for her. She watched him with Tomas Escobar at the smithy, where he talked to Tomas with the direct, uncondescending manner of a man who understood that expertise deserved respect regardless of who held it. She watched him with the horses, with the 2 mules that she had brought with the wagon and that he had integrated into his work stock with a patience that the mules, being mules, rewarded only grudgingly. She watched him and revised her understanding of him continuously, the way you revise a map when the territory keeps revealing new features. At the end of the 6th week, on a Sunday evening when the heat had finally broken, and there was a breeze from the west that smelled like rain coming, she found him sitting on the step of the house with a cup of coffee and his hat off, and she sat down beside him without being asked, which was the first time she had done that. They sat and watched the light change over the open land to the west, the way the late sun turned the grass from gold to amber and the sky went through 4 different shades of pink before settling into the deep blue of approaching evening. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right. At the auction, you said it was because what Price was doing wasn't right, and I believed that then. I still believe it." She paused. "But I've been trying to work out whether that was the whole of it." He turned to look at her. In the evening light, his face was difficult to read, which was his natural state, but there was something in the set of it that was more open than usual. "It was the beginning of it," he said. "What was the rest?" He was quiet for a long moment, and she let the quiet sit there because she had learned by now that his silences were not evasions. They were him being honest with himself about what was true before he said it to someone else. "You looked like someone who deserved better than what was happening," he said finally. "And I had the means to make it better, and so it seemed straightforward." "It is not straightforward to spend that kind of money on a stranger. Maybe not. Most men wouldn't. I'm aware." She looked at him for another moment and then looked back at the darkening sky. "I haven't thanked you," she said. "I'm aware of that too. I didn't do it for thanks. I know that's part of what makes it difficult to carry." She said it honestly, without self-pity, just putting the fact of it on the table between them the way you might put down a hand of cards so that both players could see what they were working with. "I don't do well with being in debt to someone." "You're not in debt to me," he said. "You're working. The work is worth the money. We're square. That's not how debt feels." "No," he said quietly. "I suppose it isn't." The rain came that night, a long, gentle soaking rain that the land needed badly, and Inez lay listening to it on the roof and felt something in her chest begin, very slowly, to unclench. September arrived and the air sharpened at the edges, the way Nebraska air does in early fall, and the addition to the house was finished and chinked, and had a proper floor that Inez had helped to lay board by board with a precision that made the whole room level and clean. The garden had produced well beyond what she had expected given the late start, and she had put up jars of preserves and dried vegetables that filled 2 shelves in the root cellar, and gave the winter months ahead a significantly less precarious quality than they would otherwise have had. She had also, without quite planning to, become the person in Millhaven that other women came to with problems. It had started with Delacroix's wife, Marguerite, who was struggling with a difficult pregnancy and needed someone capable and calm to come by regularly, and it had spread through the informal networks of women in the territory, the way useful information always spreads. Inez had knowledge from her mother, who had been what the frontier called a midwife, though she had also been, by any sensible measure, the nearest thing to a doctor available to most people in a 50-mile radius. Inez helped Marguerite through the last months of her pregnancy and attended the birth with steady hands and a clear head, and the boy arrived healthy and loud, and Marguerite gripped Inez's hand afterward and said with utter conviction that she would have died without her, which was probably an exaggeration but not a complete one. Charles had watched this quiet expansion of her role in the community with an expression that she was beginning to be able to read, which was a soft, careful admiration that he never expressed directly, because he had the instinct to understand that saying certain things directly would feel like condescension when they were not meant that way. One evening in mid-October, with the first serious cold settling over the land and the fire and the hearth necessary rather than optional, he asked her if she had thought about what she would do when the year's contract was up. She was mending a shirt at the table, working by lamplight with her needle moving in and out in small, precise stitches, and she did not look up right away. She let the question settle and looked at it from the inside, the way you look at a room when you are deciding whether to stay in it. "I've thought about it," she said, and she looked up then. He was across the table from her, reading, which he did most evenings, working through a battered collection of books that had traveled west with him, and that she had come to regard as a kind of autobiography of his interior life. Right now it was something by Ralph Waldo Emerson, which fit him, she thought. He had that quality of a man who had decided his own terms for things. "I don't know where else I'd go," she said, and then, because that sounded either pathetic or leading in ways she did not intend, she added quickly, "I've started something here with the women in town. The medical work, the midwifery. It would be foolish to leave before it's properly established. That's a practical reason to stay." "Yes." "Is there an impractical reason?" She looked at him steadily for a moment. The lamplight was warm between them. Outside, the wind pushed at the walls of the house with the testing insistence of a wind that is getting serious about winter. "Possibly," she said. The word sat between them for the rest of the evening, doing its own particular work. It was 3 weeks later, on a bright cold morning in early November, when everything shifted in the manner that these things shift, suddenly and completely, without warning, as if all the small accumulations of previous moments had been building to a single point that finally arrived. Inez had gone to town to visit Marguerite and check on the baby, who was fat and healthy and opinionated, and on her way back she had stopped at Delacroix's store for supplies. Albert Price was at the counter in conversation with Delacroix, and when Inez came in he turned and looked at her with his too wide smile and said, with the lightness of a man who thinks he is being charming, that he trusted she was satisfied with the arrangement he had brokered for her. Inez set down her basket on the counter with great deliberateness and looked at Albert Price for a moment. "Mr. Price," she said, "what you did on that street was shameful. What you called a custom, I call a disgrace. My father's debt was manageable. The speed with which you called in that note and organized that sale tells every person in this town something about your character that they would be wise to remember." Price's smile faltered. Delacroix, behind the counter, found something very interesting to look at in a different direction. "Now," Inez said, picking her basket back up, "I'll take 3 pounds of flour, a half-pound of coffee, and whatever good judgment you can manage to apply to the future." She walked home from town that day with a lighter step than she had carried since before her father's illness, and when she came through the gate of the Hale ranch and Charles looked up from where he was splitting wood and saw her expression, he said, "Something happened." "I said some things to Albert Price," she said. "Things that needed saying. Overdue, if anything." He put the axe down on the splitting block and looked at her with that quiet, careful smile that she had been thinking about more than was strictly comfortable. "Good," he said simply. She stopped in front of him, closer than she usually stood, because the whole walk home she had been feeling the accumulated weight of all the weeks since the auction, all the things she had watched him do and said and not said, all the revisions of the map of him that had been building in her until the map was detailed enough to trust. "I need to say something to you," she said. "All right. I told you I hadn't thanked you. I told you I don't do well with debt. That was true and it's still true. But I've been thinking about what you said that first day, that it was because it wasn't right and you had the means to make it right. And I believe that. But I also think you are a person who would have found a reason to stay in that situation, whatever the situation was, because you are the kind of person who stays when it matters." She paused. "I don't think I've met very many of that kind." He was looking at her in a way that she could read clearly now, that she had been reading for weeks and had been choosing not to fully acknowledge because acknowledging it would require her to examine her own corresponding interior with equal honesty. "Inez," he said. "I'm still angry about the auction," she said. "Not at you specifically, but at the whole circumstance of it, and you are adjacent to that circumstance, and I may be angry at the adjacency for some time. I understand. I also think I have been in love with you for approximately 6 weeks, she said, and I am telling you now because the winter is coming, and I do not want to spend it pretending that is not the case." The wind moved through the bare branches of the cottonwood trees along the fence line with a dry rattling sound. One of the mules made a comment from the barn. Charles Hale looked at Inez Collins with an expression that had nothing reserved about it, nothing calculated or careful, just the open face of a man who is hearing something true that he has been hoping to hear. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since you walked away from me on that street without a word of thanks, and I thought that was the finest thing I'd ever seen." She laughed. It was a short, startled laugh, but it was real, and it was the first time he had heard it fully, and it was exactly what he would have guessed it would be if he had tried to imagine it, which he had. He took one step toward her, and she did not step back, and he reached out and tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear that the wind had pulled loose, which was such a small, careful gesture that it undid something in her entirely, and she put her hand against his chest, and they stood there in the cold November air by the gate of the Hale ranch, while the mules judged them from the barn, and the cottonwoods rattled, and the sky went the clear, brilliant blue of a plains winter morning. He kissed her with the same quiet deliberateness he brought to everything, and she kissed him back with the directness she brought to everything, and it worked very well. They were married in March of 1875, when the worst of the winter had passed and the ground was beginning to soften, in a ceremony performed by the traveling minister, who came through Millhaven every 6 weeks, and who seemed genuinely pleased to be presiding over something optimistic after a winter of funerals and disputes. Tomas Escobar was there with his wife, Elena, who brought a cake that was the best thing Inez had eaten in years. Marguerite Delacroix came with the baby, who slept through the ceremony and woke up for the cake. Old Mrs. Hutchins sat in the best chair that Charles had brought out from the house and cried with the uncomplicated happiness of a woman who has lived long enough to know that good things should be fully appreciated when they happen. Elbert Price was not invited. He did not come. This was, by universal unspoken consensus, correct. Inez wore her mother's dress, which she had carried in the trunk in the wagon from Missouri, and which she had spent 2 weeks quietly altering and mending in the evenings, so that it fit her rather than her mother's smaller frame. When Charles first saw her in it, coming across the yard from the house in the March light, he stopped what he was doing entirely and stood completely still, and she saw the expression on his face and carried it inside herself where it would keep warm for a long time. The minister, whose name was Reverend Alt, asked the assembled group if anyone had reason to object, and Garrett Webb was not there, and Elbert Price was not there, and so no one objected, and Inez and Charles said their vows with the steady voices of 2 people who mean every word and are not performing the meaning for anyone's benefit. The spring that followed the wedding was a good one. The land came back from the winter green and cooperative, and Inez put in the most ambitious garden yet, expanded now to a scale that served not just the ranch, but also provided produce for the town market, which supplemented their income in a modest but meaningful way. Charles had been approached by several neighboring ranchers about a cattle cooperative, a joint effort to drive cattle to the rail depot at Grand Island, and the negotiations for this took up a significant portion of his spring, involving several long evenings at the table, with maps spread out, and men named Morrison and Thatcher and old Silas Reeves crowded around with their opinions and their coffee cups. Inez sat at the corner of these meetings and listened, and occasionally offered observations that were so precisely correct that they became quietly decisive, and the men around the table began to direct questions at her in a natural, unthinking way that would not have been possible 6 months earlier, which said something about how completely she had established herself as a person whose judgment was worth having. She was also, by April, fairly certain she was expecting a child. She kept this information to herself for 6 weeks, not from any desire to withhold it from Charles, but from a private superstition she had absorbed from her mother, who had always said that the first weeks of a new thing were for the new thing, and not for the world's opinions of it. When she told Charles in May, on an evening when the air was warm for the first time and they were sitting on the step the way they had sat on the late August evening when something had first begun to change between them, he was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something mattered, and then he put his arm around her and she leaned into his shoulder, and they sat there while the creek ran behind the house and the sky went dark. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "No," she said, and meant it. "Are you?" "Terrified," he said pleasantly. She laughed and leaned into him more firmly. "The pregnancy was a good one." Inez had the advantage of understanding what was happening better than most women in the territory, having attended enough births and absorbed enough of her mother's knowledge to know what the normal course looked like and when to be concerned, and the normal course was what it was. She continued her work with the women of the community throughout, which caused some raised eyebrows from people who felt that pregnant women should be horizontal and decorative rather than active and useful, and she disregarded these opinions with the efficiency of long practice. Charles hovered in the particular way of a man who wants to be helpful and is deeply uncertain of his role, which manifested as an extraordinary number of unsolicited improvements to the house, including a second window in the main room, a new shelf system in the kitchen, and a cradle that he built over the course of 2 months, and that became, in Inez's opinion, the finest piece of woodworking she had ever personally witnessed. She did not tell him this immediately because she was concerned it would make him insufferable, but she told him eventually, and he had the grace to look pleased without being insufferable. Their son was born in November of 1875, on a cold, clear day when the sky was the precise blue of a November sky that has decided to be beautiful as compensation for the temperature. He arrived without complication, which Inez had counted on but not taken for granted, and he was large and healthy and possessed of a volume that suggested he had decided opinions and intended to share them. They named him Robert for her father. Charles had suggested it without being asked, and without making a production of the suggestion, which was exactly right, and Inez looked at him when he said it with an expression that told him clearly that he had done something true and good. Robert Collins Hale was a remarkably opinionated infant and grew into a remarkably opinionated toddler, and his parents were both delighted by this and occasionally exhausted by it, which seemed to them the appropriate balance. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's jaw, and a personality that seemed to have been assembled from components of both of them and then amplified, as children often are, to a higher setting. The cattle cooperative that Charles had helped organize made its first drive to Grand Island in the fall of 1876, and it was successful enough that a second and third drive were planned, and the participating ranchers found themselves in a meaningfully more stable financial position than they had been in before. Charles had a reputation now in the county as a man who was fair and had good judgment and was worth consulting on practical matters, which suited him in the same way that the ranch suited him, without requiring him to be anyone other than who he was. Inez's medical work had expanded in ways she had not fully anticipated. By the spring of 1876, she was the closest thing to a doctor that most of the women in a 30-mile radius had reliable access to, and she had started keeping careful notes on everything she did in a journal that grew thick with cases and observations, and the accumulated practical knowledge of a woman who paid close attention to what she saw. There was a real doctor in Grand Island, a young man named Dr. Havelock who had studied in Chicago, and she had ridden out to Grand Island twice to consult with him on cases that were beyond her training, and he had treated her with a professional respect that was gratifying and that she had not quite expected, given the territory's general attitude toward the capacities of women. The second time she went to Grand Island, she brought the journal, and Havelock spent an hour reading it with increasing attention, and said at the end that she had documented 3 cases of childbed fever management that were genuinely interesting, and that he would like to write up with her for a medical publication. She had looked at him steadily over the table in his office, and said she supposed that would be useful, and he said he supposed it would, and the correspondence between them afterward was one of the more intellectually satisfying relationships of her adult life, entirely professional and entirely genuine. She told Charles about this on her return from the second Grand Island trip, and he listened to the whole account with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered and then said he thought Havelock had good sense. Inez said she agreed. Charles said he had fixed the back fence while she was gone, and had also managed to lose Robert's hat twice in the space of one afternoon, and had spent the second time in a state of considerable parental panic before finding it under the table where the boy had put it himself, and then forgotten. Inez laughed and said she had full confidence in his hat-finding abilities and none whatsoever in his hat organization abilities, and Charles said that seemed about right, and they ate supper together in the warm kitchen with Robert making architectural decisions about his cornbread, and the whole evening had the quality of something so good that it was almost impossible to hold all of it at once. In 1877, a dry year that stressed the grassland ranches further west and sent a wave of displaced families through Millhaven, Inez found herself serving as an informal coordinator for the women and children who came through with nothing, connecting them to resources and employment, and housing with a practicality and efficiency that would have impressed anyone who was paying attention. Charles helped where he could, taking on 2 of the displaced ranch hands and absorbing the cost of feeding several families through the worst month of the summer, without making any particular announcement about it. It was during this period that Inez finally, in the quiet way that she did most important things, put down the last of the anger about the auction. She did not experience it as a dramatic moment of forgiveness or resolution. It was more like a stone that she had been carrying for a long time and had become so accustomed to carrying that she did not notice its weight until the moment she put it down, and then the absence of it was remarkable. She was helping a woman named Clara Marsh settle her 3 children for the night in the extra room of the house, while Clara's husband looked for work, and she heard Charles through the wall talking to the oldest Marsh boy, who was 12 and frightened and trying hard not to show it. And Charles was talking to him the way he talked to everyone who was frightened, with the calm and the practical kindness. And the boy's voice slowly lost its tight, held-in quality and became the ordinary voice of a 12-year-old. And Inez stood in the room with Clara Marsh and 2 sleeping small children and felt, with complete clarity, that she loved the man in the next room without reservation or condition. The anger had not been at him. She knew that already. She had always known it, but now it was simply gone, and what remained was the clear, clean fact of the thing itself. She told him that night, after the Marsh family was settled and the house was quiet and they were in their room with the lamp turned low and the creek running outside the window where it always was. She said, without preamble, that she thought she had not entirely forgiven him for the auction until now. He looked at her without surprise and without hurt and said he understood. She said what she had needed to forgive was not him but everything surrounding it, and he said he understood that too. She said she was fully and completely done carrying it now, and she looked at him with the clear, direct gaze that had been the first thing he had noticed about her on a dusty Nebraska street 2.5 years ago, and he reached across in the low lamplight and took her hand. "I know," he said. "I've seen it happening." "Have you?" she said. "For months, you've been putting it down piece by piece. I've been watching." "You watch everything," she said, not as a complaint. "Only what matters," he said. The year 1878 brought a mild winter, and then a productive spring, and then a piece of news that arrived via the Territorial Land Office, which was that the parcel adjacent to the Hale Ranch, the one that had been in disputed ownership for 2 years due to a contested claim filing, had finally been resolved, and the resolution was in Charles's favor, the claim having been filed correctly and the competing claim having been found deficient in its documentation. The additional land doubled the ranch's viable acreage and made possible a scale of cattle operation that had previously been theoretical. It also meant that the ranch needed a proper name, because a property of that size was taken more seriously when it had won. They argued about this with affection and minimal progress for 2 weeks. Inez's suggestions tended toward the practical and descriptive, which she admitted made for dull names. Charles's suggestions were better in the abstract than in the execution, and he had the self-awareness to acknowledge this. They eventually settled on the Collins Creek Ranch, which honored her father's name and the creek that ran along the property's edge, and which Charles offered without ceremony one morning over coffee, and which Inez accepted with a nod that contained several things she did not say, but that he understood perfectly well. Robert was 3 years old by then, a small, emphatic person who had opinions about horses that were more sophisticated than his opinions about most other things, and who had decided that Tomas Escobar was the finest human being in Millhaven, possibly because Tomas let him sit on the rail of the smithy and watch the work, which nobody else allowed. Tomas and Elena Escobar had become the nearest thing to family that either Inez or Charles had in the territory, and the Sunday dinners that rotated between the two households were the fixed points around which the week reliably organized itself. In the spring of 1879, Inez was expecting again, which she told Charles in the same way she had told him the first time, on the step in the evening, though this time she added that she thought she preferred the evenings when the news was settled between them, and they could simply sit with it before it belonged to anyone else. He said he agreed completely. This pregnancy was as uncomplicated as the first, and in October of 1879, a daughter arrived, red-faced and decisive, and was named Elena, for Charles's mother who had died when he was 17, and whom he had mentioned exactly twice and both times with the careful brevity of someone who did not say much because the feeling was large. Inez held Elena on the first evening and looked at her with the same direct attention she gave to everything and said, "She has your coloring." "She has your expression already," Charles said, which was accurate, the baby having arranged her face into something that suggested she was evaluating the situation and forming preliminary conclusions. Robert's reaction to Elena was cautious and then proprietary. He spent several days regarding her from a careful distance, and then one morning simply decided she was acceptable, and thereafter treated her with the protective seriousness of a 4-year-old who has identified someone smaller that he can be responsible for, which satisfied a quality of character that had been present in him from the beginning. The decade turned. Millhaven grew. The railroad survey that the two entertainment-seeking men had been conducting in 1874 had eventually resulted in a spur line that reached within 20 miles of the town, which changed everything about its economic position and brought new people and new businesses and a new energy that was not entirely comfortable and was entirely inevitable. The main street that Inez had stood on in the summer of 1874 was unrecognizable now, with proper storefronts and a covered boardwalk and a 2-story hotel that had replaced Harmon's Saloon as the social center of the town. Albert Price had, in the intervening years, made several poor financial decisions that were entirely his own doing, and had seen his position in the community diminish accordingly. He was still in Millhaven, running a reduced operation in a smaller office, and when his path crossed Inez's in town, she met him with the same level, unencumbered courtesy she extended to everyone, which was, she had found, a more effective form of correction than anything else she might have done. The Collins Creek Ranch in 1880 was a real operation, with 8 ranch hands, a proper house with 4 rooms and a deep porch that Inez used in the summer evenings as her office for the medical work, a barn that would have satisfied a man twice as prosperous, and a kitchen garden that had been expanded twice, and that produced more than the family needed, and supplied the hotel in town as well. The cattle cooperative that Charles had helped found was the model for 2 similar cooperatives that had formed in neighboring counties, which meant his reputation had spread in the useful, practical way that he preferred to more theatrical kinds of fame. Robert started school in Millhaven in the fall of 1880, walking the 4 miles into town with the Collins Creek boys on the days when the weather allowed and riding when it did not, and he announced after the first week that the school teacher, a thin, serious young woman from Ohio named Miss Faraday, knew a great many things, and he intended to learn all of them, which he proceeded to do with the focused determination that characterized everything he did. Eleanor, at a year old, had meanwhile developed clear opinions about the ranch horse that was kept in the near paddock, pointing at it at every available opportunity, and producing a word that was either the horse's name or her own version of horse in general. It was in November of 1880, 6 years after the auction, that Inez stood on the porch of the Collins Creek Ranch house on a cold, clear morning, and looked out at the land that now spread wide and well tended to the horizon in every direction, and thought about the broken wagon and the main street of Millhaven, and the man who had walked across the dirt with his hat low and his hands in his pockets, and had put money on a table with a deliberateness that was not dramatic, but was entirely definitive. She thought about standing beside that broken wagon with her chin up, and her fists clenched, and her eyes fixed on a horizon that was not this horizon. That was some imagined other place where none of what was happening, and how wrong that strategy had been, how the real good things had turned out to be precisely here and not elsewhere, and how that would not have been visible from the position of a woman standing beside a broken wagon with her eyes fixed on the distance. The door opened behind her, and Charles came out with 2 cups of coffee, which was how most of their mornings began, and he stood beside her and handed her a cup and looked at the same land she was looking at. After a moment he said, "What are you thinking about?" She considered it honestly, the way she considered most things. "The wagon," she said. He was quiet for a moment, understanding what she meant. "Do you still have it?" "In the barn. I've never been able to put it entirely out of service. It still works." "Your father built it solid," Charles said, echoing what Tomas Escobar had said 6 years ago, and Inez felt the small ache that her father's memory always carried and let herself feel it fully, because she had learned that was better than avoiding it. "He did," she said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the land, then said, "I want to say something to you." "Say it." She turned and looked at him in the November morning, with the steam from the coffee rising between them and the light still low and gold in the east, and she said, "I know I was not easy about the auction. I know I made it difficult for a long time. I know I told you I hadn't forgiven you when what I meant was that I hadn't finished being angry at the whole of everything it represented, and I put that on you, which wasn't fair." "Inez, let me finish." She met his eyes. "I am grateful. I am fully and completely grateful, and I'm done with the pride that kept me from saying so. You walked across a street in the summer of 1874 and paid a debt that was not yours and changed the entire direction of my life. And you did it because it was right. And then you gave me the space to be angry about it and the time to come to my own conclusions, and never once asked me to acknowledge it in any way you didn't mean. And that is—" She stopped, because she was, in her way, still not someone who cried easily, but something was pressing warmly behind her eyes. "That is one of the finest things anyone has ever done for me." Charles looked at her for a long moment with the open face he had shown her on a November afternoon when she had told him without preamble that she had been in love with him for 6 weeks. Then he said, quietly and with complete sincerity, "You would have found another way." She laughed, a soft sound. "Probably. Definitely," he said. "I just happened to be there." "You were not just there," she said firmly. "You do not get to diminish it." "Then you don't get to apologize for the 6 years it took you to say thank you," he said. "Those 6 years were not a cost. They were the whole of everything." She looked at him for a moment more and then stepped closer, and he put his free arm around her, and she leaned into him in the cold morning, the way she had leaned into him on other mornings and other evenings across the years that had made up the architecture of their life together. "The whole of everything," she repeated, as if testing the weight of it. "And then some," he said. Inside the house, Robert's voice rose in the particular tone he used when Eleanor had gotten into something she should not have gotten into, and Eleanor's voice replied with the tone she used when she was entirely unrepentant. And the ordinary domestic music of their family moved through the walls of the house and out into the cold air, and Inez and Charles stood on the porch of the Collins Creek Ranch and drank their coffee. By the spring of 1881, Charles had begun teaching Robert to work the cattle in earnest, partly because the boy was old enough and wanted to learn, and partly because there was a great deal to learn, and it was better to start early. Robert turned 6 that year and was already confident on horseback in the way that children who grow up among horses become confident, without the self-consciousness of someone who learned as an adult. He sat a horse with his mother's posture and his father's patience, and Tomas Escobar said once, watching him come in from the south pasture, that Robert Collins Hale was going to be the kind of person that land respected, which was the highest compliment Tomas gave to anyone. Alina at 2 had graduated from pointing at horses to attempting to climb into the paddock to reach the horses, which required a new level of parental vigilance, and the installation of an additional rail on the lowest fence section, which Charles completed with a mixture of love and exasperation that was entirely characteristic of him. She had also developed an alliance with Tomas Escobar's youngest daughter, a girl named Pilar who was a year older, and the two of them conducted their friendship with a seriousness that was equal parts adorable and mildly alarming. The medical journal that Inez had written with Dr. Havelock was published in a Chicago medical publication in early 1881, which generated more correspondence than she had anticipated, and one particularly significant letter from a woman in Omaha who was establishing what she described as a practical medical training program for women, and who had read the journal and wanted to know whether Inez Collins Hale would be willing to come to Omaha for 2 weeks in the fall to give a series of lectures on frontier midwifery and obstetric management. Inez read this letter 3 times and then put it on the table and went and found Charles in the barn and read it to him. He listened to the whole letter and then said, "Can you go in October?" "I don't know," she said. The children will be fine. Robert is at school. Alina and I have a working arrangement." He paused. "She understands that I'm in charge when you're gone, even if she has some alternative views on the topic." Inez looked at him for a long moment. "You want me to go?" "I think you should go," he said. "I think you've built something here that is important, and I think this is part of the same work, and I think you know that." She wrote back to the woman in Omaha, a Dr. Vivian Searcy, and said she would come in October. The 2 weeks in Omaha were among the most intellectually engaged she had spent since she could remember, surrounded by women who were doing serious work with serious competence, and who received her accumulated frontier knowledge with the genuine appetite of people who understood its value. She gave her lectures and answered questions for hours after each one, and filled a new notebook with things she had learned from the women around her. And she came home to the Collins Creek ranch on a gray October afternoon with a fuller mind and a lighter heart than she had expected. Robert was waiting at the gate when she rode in, which meant Charles had told him what time to expect her, and he said with formal seriousness that everything had been fine while she was away, and Alina had only climbed the fence twice, and the new calf had arrived healthy, and Inez hugged him hard enough that he made a protest that was only partially genuine. Charles came out of the barn and took her horse and said, with the quiet pleasure he took in her returns, that there was stew on the stove and he wanted to hear everything. Alina appeared from nowhere and attached herself to Inez's left leg and refused to release it for 20 minutes, during which Inez moved through the kitchen serving up the stew with Alina still attached, which Alina seemed to consider a perfectly appropriate way to welcome someone home. After supper, with the children in bed and the fire in the hearth doing what November fires do, Inez told Charles everything about Omaha, the lectures and the women and the work they were doing and what she had learned and what she thought it meant for what she was doing here. He listened with the full attention he had always given her and asked questions that were good questions, the kind that showed he was following the ideas rather than just the words, and she thought, not for the first time, that she was fortunate in the particular quality of his listening. At the end of the evening, when the fire had burned low and the night was quiet around the house, he said, "What do you want to do next?" She thought about it. "Build something more permanent here," she said. "Something that doesn't depend on me specifically. A room or a building attached to the house where women from the county can come, proper equipment, regular hours. Something that could continue if I were gone or if someone else needed to take it over. A clinic, he said, something like one. We have the space. The room on the east side of the new addition was never properly allocated. I know, she said. I've been thinking about it since we built it, he smiled. I know you have. The clinic room was built out properly over the winter of 1881 to 1882, with a separate door from the outside so that patients did not need to come through the house, a proper examination table that Tomas Escobar helped build to Inez's specifications, shelves for supplies, and a small stove for the winter months. It was not a hospital. It was not even a proper doctor's office by the standards of what was available in larger towns. But it was clean and functional and staffed by a woman who had been accumulating knowledge for a decade and who took every case with the same serious, careful attention. The first morning the clinic room was open, 3 women came, which was 3 more than Charles had privately predicted, and which he did not say out loud because he had learned when to keep predictions to himself. Inez worked until mid-afternoon and then came in for dinner with the expression of a woman who has found the correct version of something she has been working on for a long time. She was 31 years old. She had come to Nebraska in a broken wagon with 2 mules and a trunk and her father's debts, and she had been auctioned in a street, and she had driven 4 miles south to a half-finished ranch with her jaw set, and her pride intact, and her capacity for anger already beginning to acquire the shape of its eventual resolution. And she had built a life here that was particular and real and entirely her own, even though much of it had been built alongside and with Charles Hale. And possibly because of that, rather than in spite of it. She thought about this sometimes when she was in the clinic room, and a patient was being difficult or a case was complicated, and she needed something to hold on to while she worked. She thought about the wedding in March of 1875 in the cold, bright air with Tomas and Alina, and the baby and old Mrs. Hutchins. She thought about the evening on the step when she had told him she had been in love with him for 6 weeks, and he had said she had walked away without thanks, and that was the finest thing he had ever seen. She thought about Robert's first solid steps across the kitchen floor, and Alina's absolute conviction about horses and Charles reading in the lamplight in the evenings with his feet up on the edge of the table and the quiet, continuous, sustaining ordinariness of a life that was also, in every way that counted, extraordinary. In the spring of 1883, when the wildflowers came up thick on the south pasture, and the creek ran high from a good snowmelt, Inez discovered she was expecting a 3rd child. She was 32 and Charles was 40, and the news arrived with a somewhat different character than it had arrived the first 2 times, carrying more experience and more ease and perhaps a deeper, quieter joy. She told him in the morning this time rather than in the evening, sitting at the kitchen table before the children were up, with the early light coming through the east window and the ranch already waking around them. He put his coffee down and looked at her and smiled. And it was the full, rare smile that he kept for things that genuinely moved him, and she leaned across the corner of the table and kissed him, which was not their usual morning habit, but felt like exactly the right thing for exactly this moment. Their 2nd son was born in December of 1883, in the clinic room, attended by Inez's own practiced hands and those of a young woman named Ada Sperry, who had been working with Inez for the past year, and who was, in Inez's considered opinion, the most naturally gifted medical practitioner she had ever encountered. The boy was named James, for no particular reason except that when they were considering names, it was the one that both of them arrived at independently and simultaneously, which seemed like sufficient reason. James was a placid baby who regarded the world with an unhurried curiosity that was distinct from both his older siblings' personalities, and that suggested he had decided to take things at his own pace and see what developed. Robert, who was 8, received him with the expansive generosity of a person who has established his position so firmly that he can afford to be generous. Alina, who was 4, immediately declared that she was in charge of his hat and proceeded to make this declaration real in practice. Charles, at 40, with 3 children and a working ranch and a wife whose reputation extended across the county and was beginning to reach beyond it, was a man who had found the space he had been looking for when he moved west from Kansas and then from Ohio before that, and who had found it not in the literal openness of the land, though that was part of it, but in the particular configuration of this life with this woman in this place. He thought about Ohio rarely and about Kansas less, and when he did it was without longing, which was the clearest evidence he had that he was where he was supposed to be. On a clear evening in the summer of 1884, 10 years after the auction, Inez and Charles sat on the deep porch of the Collins Creek Ranch house and listened to the complicated sounds of their 3 children inside the house negotiating some arrangement that involved James's blanket and Alina's horse figure and Robert's considered arbitration. The creek ran behind the property, and the evening light was the long, gold, horizontal kind that the Nebraska summer produced at this hour, and the land stretched wide and green and good to the horizon. 10 years, Inez said. Charles looked at her, knowing exactly what she meant. 10 years. I drove up to this ranch in a broken wagon that you had paid to have fixed, she said, and I was so angry and so proud that I could barely speak a civil sentence. You spoke several civil sentences, he said. Occasionally even more than were strictly required. She smiled. That first supper, salt pork and dried beans that had been living on that stove for what appeared to be some time. It was adequate nutrition, he said with the dignity of a man defending something indefensible. It was terrible, she said. It was the worst meal I ate in 1874, and 1874 was a difficult year for meals. The garden improved things considerably. The garden improved things considerably because I attacked it at 6 in the morning on the second day. Which was, he said, the most sensible thing either of us did in that first week. She laughed and leaned her head on his shoulder, which she had done in this way for nearly a decade, and which still felt like coming to rest after a long day. He put his arm around her, which was where it went. Inside the house, Robert's voice reached an authoritative note, and there was a brief silence that suggested the blanket and horse figure situation had been resolved, at least temporarily. "Are you happy?" he asked, not because he did not know the answer, but because the question was one that deserved to be asked periodically, out loud, between 2 people who had built something together. She considered it with the honesty she gave to everything: the clinic room and the work, the children, the ranch that bore her father's name along the creek, Tomas and Alina and their Sunday dinners, Dr. Searcy in Omaha and the letters they continued to exchange. The land outside this porch stretching to the horizon in the evening light. The man with his arm around her, whose quiet, deliberate presence had been the most constant thing in her life since the morning she drove a repaired wagon 4 miles south of a town where she had been auctioned beside a broken wheel. Completely, she said. And then, because it was true, and because 10 years was long enough to have earned the full weight of saying it, "Thank you." He understood what she meant, all of what she meant, the same way he always understood what she meant. He tightened his arm around her briefly, the way you hold something you know to be good when you are fortunate enough to have it. "You would have found another way," he said again, the same thing he had said the first time she thanked him, gentle and certain. "Maybe," she said, "but I'm glad I found this one." The evening light lay golden on the Collins Creek Ranch, and the creek ran steady behind the house, and the 3 Hale children arranged and rearranged their small world with the energy and conviction of people who have been given a good solid place to stand. And Inez Collins Hale and Charles Hale sat on their porch in the Nebraska summer and held the whole of everything they had built between them quietly, without needing to say another word about it. Which was, all things considered, exactly right.